Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show. With President Trump's legal challenges falling like ninepins, it seems that the new team of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris can set about measuring the curtains in the Oval Office. However, the rival Trump must stay and Trump must go demonstrations of the last few days reflect the polarization of the American political system. The result of the presidential poll raises fresh questions for America. Will the new administration bind up the wounds of the nation, or will deadlock in the Senate reflect more bitter divisions to come? Is President Biden a transitional figure for the Democrats, and will the Donald be hitting the fairways or the campaign trail for 2024? We ask key experts from the left and right of American politics, Wither America. And then one of the world's most famous anthropologists, Wade Davis, explains the changes in American society which dictate the political future of the world's most powerful country. But first, to your tweets, messages and emails. Last week's show on photographer extraordinaire Harry Benton excited great interest. Sharon said, had the privilege of meeting him many years ago when I was curating a football exhibition. He was a good friend of another well-known press photographer who kindly gave permission to use some of his fantastic images and brought him along to meet me. I had no idea then just how significant he was in the media world. So down to earth, both of them, a treasured memory. Evelyn says, what a brilliant photographer and a fascinating man. Kay says, what an interesting guy. Ali Rihal says, Harry seems like an absolutely sound dude. Well done to him. Amazing career. And finally, Ferdos Heather says, I heard of him before and saw his still photographs. Nice seeing him speaking and sharing his excellent memories of the past. Great man. Indeed so. Now over to Alex with Professor Kenesha Grant of Howard University and Ed Martin, President of the Phyllis Schlafly Eagle Society and co-author of The Conservative Case for Trump.
Can I come to you first, Professor? You must be pretty pleased. I mean, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris looking pretty presidential in the podium. They think they're home. They think they're going to be going into administration come January. Are you celebrating there in Howard University?
I have to admit I am. I don't know how to express to you what it feels like to have a vice president of the United States from Howard University, the first Black woman, the first woman of Asian descent, and then the first historically Black college graduate being the vice president. It means a tremendous deal to all of us and a tremendous deal to the community of Black college graduates worldwide.
Now, Ed, I mean, obviously not the result that you were looking for in the election, but as the president, he's looking not very presidential, this reluctance to concede defeat. I mean, it makes him look like a bit of a bad loser, does it not?
Well, Alex, you know, we have this great system here in America that we have had for a couple hundred years that works really well. And when it comes to our elections, we have a process that plays out. There's no, the word concession doesn't appear in the Constitution or the rule of law. It's more, as you say, a tradition. There's major issues here, and it's coming to a head in the next 3 or 4 weeks because you mentioned we're celebrating. I'm celebrating at every level in America. The Republican vision of positive America first won. So we'll get to the bottom of it. If the rule of law and everything works out, then you'll be ushering in President Biden. But I think we have a long way to go. And what we're seeing more and more is, Alex, on a scale we've never seen, at least seen, interference in the election that we're going to get to the bottom of it. So it's going to be very important for America, and we're looking forward to it.
Yeah, but I remember back when Al Gore and President Bush, as he became, were contesting the hanging chads in Florida. Yeah. And they even managed to go through that without looking, unpresidential, and they weren't even in office at the time. Don't you think Donald Trump is looking distinctly unpresidential in the way that he's apparently challenging the result in state after state with what seems pretty flimsy evidence?
Well, I mean, maybe, Alex, but we're 20 years later in terms of the coverage. Al Gore was vice president, it should be said, and so he was hanging on, and he hung on for 37 days. And Al Gore only conceded when the Supreme Court of Florida told him, and the U.S. Supreme Court made a decision, while the Florida legislature was in session to choose electors because Al Gore wouldn't concede. Let me say this. I think you pointed to something, Alex, which I appreciate about RT and you. We in America have never seen the media do what they're doing right now. There is a full-on effort to brainwash the American people to concede. You're a bad person if you don't concede, even though 73 million Americans voted for Donald Trump, and they're wondering, why did Philadelphia have, Joe Biden had greater turnout in Philadelphia than Obama or Clinton? It doesn't sound right, might be right, but let's get to the bottom of it. So how he looks is a function of the media in America and the world, not what the truth is. And America we don't play by the looks. We play by the Constitution and the rule of law. It's worked well for a couple hundred years. I think it'll work well for a few more months and then a couple hundred years after that.
Professor Grant, isn't Ed right? I mean, isn't President Trump just doing what Al Gore did 20 years ago, fighting the case to the end? He's entitled to fight the case to the end before he finally makes a concession. I mean, you're a professor of political studies, you know these things. Isn't he just doing what's been done before?
There's so many ways that that's not right, that it's hard for me to remember them, to tick them down for you, but let me try a little bit. So the first thing that's happening is that the situation in Florida is to do with the fact that the election is close, that they have an automatic recount in the same way that Georgia has currently, and that there are questions about some problems in the way that those elections were organized. And so this is absolutely not the same thing, because there is no question about the way the election was organized. There's no question about how the ballots were structured. There have been many changes since the year 2000. Turnout is up across the United States, in red states, in blue states, in conservative rural areas, in Democratic cities. It's up everywhere. Joe Biden got the most votes. So I'm happy to see this play out. I'm happy to see folks count and recount, because at the end of the day, Joe Biden got the most votes, not just among individual Americans, but he will have the most votes in the Electoral College, no matter what happens in these places where people are arguing about the margins potentially being off by 100 or 200 votes. We're talking about 1 million or 4 million vote difference between those. And we're talking about dozens of votes in the Electoral College. So again, I say, if you want to count and recount, have at it. I'm sure that Joe Biden will be the winner at the end of that.
So let's try and rise above the legal arm wrestling and look at some of the fundamentals here. It doesn't Professor Grant have a point, Ed, that it turned out it was up for both the Republicans and the Democrats, but Joe Biden emerged very clearly in the popular vote. Isn't that really a good thing for American politics? It shows a much higher level of participation in an election. And when people stand back from this in a few months' time, want to say, well, actually, we're onto something here. Whatever messy bits in the election there was, people wanted to get to the polls or to vote this time. Isn't that a good thing for both sides?
If the American people don't trust what they're seeing, I think you can give them some credit for saying, hey, make sure you count every legal vote. If you know elections and campaigns, Alex, in America, you have a certain trend that they go on. And you may wish that you're a great candidate in the Democrat Party, but you were losing on Election Day down ballot. Nancy Pelosi lost an amazing number of seats. She promised she would win, and the polls said she would win. The Senate was supposed to flip. The polls said so. Schumer promised. They lost. The only place there was a problem was the place where we see very irregular voting patterns for Joe Biden. Let's get to the bottom of it. But pardon me if Americans aren't a little skeptical of being told by the media or being told by academia to trust us, we know better. We'll stick to the document, the Constitution and the rule of law. And when we get to the bottom of it, we'll accept the results.
So, Professor Grant, I mean, how do you get forward and rise above these arguments, even as they play through? I mean, how do the fairly entrenched views that we see in America, how do they start? I mean, both you and Ed are articulate communicators from your perspective in politics, but how do you reach out and get a sort of dialogue that can get through the political system and try to break through some of these entrenched bitterness that we see just now?
You know, the short and honest answer is that I don't know. We, on this show, are having a conversation that's worlds away from each other. We have different notions of truth. And I think that the notions of truth that I have are based on what I have learned from years of study of the entire history of the United States of America. It's based on our documents. For example, voting is a thing that is managed at the state level. It's not managed in the Constitution. It's something that is managed through the state legislatures. And so if we continue to live in a world where we have these very different notions of the world. We will continue to have a polarized nation. And I don't know what we can do in a polarized nation where people are unwilling to deal with books and science and reason. And so I think that, again, is not a good way to be, and it's not a good way for our democracy to exist. And as long, again, as we have these media outlets and these talking heads creating scenarios where people are arguing at each other instead of trying to find common ground, we're going to always have this problem.
Ed, I've read your book. You co-authored The Conservative Case for Trump. Right. And although it's not my political inclination, let's put it that way, there were some very coherent arguments in it. But I wonder if the arguments are somehow disconnected from the personality of Donald Trump. I mean, there are some essential arguments you can see the quality of, whether you agree with them or not. But can there not something come out of this where the Conservative case can be separated from the current incumbent president and presented perhaps in a way which will assist dialogue?
Yeah, look, I don't think that Trumpism is a thing. I think it's I call it America First, pro-America movement. I agree with you, but we embraced a different kind of movement. When we took on China, it wasn't just because the corporate interest, Alex, on Wall Street wanted it. They didn't. In fact, they want Biden to win because they think Biden will go back to trading with China. But we had a president that put people that were different from a Republican traditional party in there. When Joe Biden says, let's unite, we're going to unite. Do you know that in the last 2 weeks of the campaign, Alex, Joe Biden ran an ad that called Donald Trump and his supporters Nazis? Do you know how hard it is, Alex? I've been called dumb. I've been called, not smart. I've been called incorrect. When you call us Nazis and then you try to unite us, I'm not against Joe Biden as a man. I am against a leadership that refuses to make room for all of us. He's dividing us. He's not uniting us. And the American people feel it.
Lastly, Professor Grant, I mean, as you probably know, I've had my own personal run-ins with President Trump in the courts and elsewhere. But isn't there something which indicates that despite what people might think about his style and what I might think about his style, he certainly has appealed to a new constituency for the Republican Party? Now, the Democrats thinking longer term, isn't that something they're going to have to understand and respond to in future political contests?
I think you're absolutely right. I think that, for example, this uptick in the number of Hispanic voters who supported Donald Trump, the uptick in the number of Black voters who supported Donald Trump is going to be important for the Democratic Party to figure out. The support for the Democratic Party is still well over 85% in the Black community, and so it's still a supermajority, but I think that the Democratic Party organizes itself as one that has more than that. And so certainly we want to understand what happened. This conversation that we're having about feeling like people who are professors or otherwise educated is something that we have to talk about too. The person on the other side of this conversation has more books in his background than I do, and is an author in the same way that I am. And so I suspect that he has lots of education. I don't think in any way that he's dumb or that he's ignorant or incorrect or any of these other things. I think that we have different ways of discussing the issue. There are many smart people in conservative circles. Clearly, they're smart because they have strategies that win down ballot races. I think that we have many things to figure out on the Democratic side. I think many of those things include those identity politics, like what's happening with Hispanic voters and Black voters. But I think that there is also a fundamental disconnect about the role of information in our society and about these ideas that liberal elites run the world and look down their noses at other people. I'm a first-generation college graduate. My mother did not go to college. In no way would I ever turn up my nose at a person who didn't go to school because I know what that's like. That's where I'm raised, and the successes I have come off the backs of people who sacrificed for me. And so, again, I think that we need to get to a place in American politics where we can see each other as human and not as demons. And if we get to that place, we'll do better for our society in the United States and for the entire global community.
Professor Grant, Ed Martin, you're both very welcome to articulate your respective viewpoints on the Alex Salmond Show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Join us after the break, when Alex will be getting the latest lowdown on the US election from leading world expert and anthropologist Wade Davis. Welcome back. Such is the force of Donald Trump's personality that politics in America have revolved around his Twitter feed. But the electoral map shows deep underlying changes behind the political divisions. Alex is joined by leading anthropologist Wade Davis to explain what is going on.
Wade Davis, welcome back to the Alex Salmond Show.
Thanks for having me, Alex, again.
Wade, in the first half of the programme, we've just had a debate between Professor Kenesha Grant of Howard University and Ed Martin of the Eagles, both respected and articulate commentators from the left and right. It was pretty fiery stuff. Now, so how deep are the divisions post-election in American society?
Yeah, I think, Alex, you hit the nail on the head there. The thing that haunted me about the results was not who won or who didn't win, but how close the margins were. And the haunting thing for those of us who are outside of the United States, and that includes a majority of the world, looking in askance at a man who has a record that we don't even need to once again articulate, Donald Trump, in terms of his violation of every norm. I won't even start. But the bottom line is that a guy like Trump wouldn't have won 5% of the vote in a place like Canada. And yet in the United States, you know, he came within 80,000 votes spread across those states from earning a second term in office. And even now he is making threats to run in 2024. So, you know, you have this very haunting chasm between realities, and it's accentuated by this propensity of the democratization of opinion. You know, Patrick Moynihan, one of the great American senators, said, "You're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts." Well, it's almost as if now people feel they are entitled to their own facts, and they simply make them up. I don't know what the future holds at a critical time in American history if this chasm between the two halves of the American reality is not bridged in some way.
Wade, let me try something which I find very difficult personally, but nonetheless I'm going to make an attempt. In defence of President Trump, I mean, couldn't it be argued, firstly, that he, however he's done it, has managed to appeal to groups that the Republican Party didn't previously appeal to? And secondly, isn't he, in his attitude now, kind of replicating what the Democrats did in terms of questioning the legitimacy of his presidency, basically right through the last 4 years? So in defence of the Donald, isn't there something in the argument that he must have something going for him?
Well, I think you're right. He certainly has appeal, obviously. You know, again, get back to the numbers. But I think the most haunting thing about these results was that at the end of the day, Alex, it really all came down to race. This is what's haunting. 58% of whites voted for Trump. The vast majority of people of color voted for the Democrats. And what at the base of all of this is a certain part of the society saying, stop the world, we want to get off. You know, we want to go back to an America before our jobs were shipped overseas. We want to go back to America when the family meant this. We want to go back to a time when, you know, we saw people that looked like us in the streets of our city. You know, never forget that race remains tragically the story of America. You know, we think of, say, the era of slavery as sort of a distant era when cotton was king. But no, you know, cotton was to the 19th century what oil was to the 20th century. American wealth and prosperity was built, this sort of post-Civil War myth that it was sort of a quaint but fading economic model that was, in the end, was going to fizzle away because it was inefficient. Simply not the case. The wealth of America was built on African labor, Black labor. And this continues to this day. And I think that's what really haunted us as Canadians. You know, if you think by contrast, certainly, Alex, as you well know, I mean, it was your people that filled our country of Canada. I mean, the Scots, the Irish, the Welsh, and so on, right? We were a lily white society in the day, essentially in the year that I was born. Today, fully half of the residents of our biggest city, Toronto, aren't just of a non-white ethnicity. They were physically born outside of Canada. And yet somehow we have managed to, in a very positive way, absorb the multitudes of the world, flourish enrich our economy, and create a much more interesting place to live without resistance. Whereas in the United States, what you're seeing is the ongoing legacy of one of the other cardinal rules, which was in the American South, the one thing that, to a great extent, the exploited poor, white, working class, white trash, as it used to be called. The one thing they had going for themselves is that they weren't Black. And some of that is just lingering in this haunting divide of race that is the underbelly of these electoral results.
You've touched on two very fundamental things, so let's take them in turn. First, the divisions within American society, and then second, the Americans' position as the world's preeminent power, both under challenge. So the divisions in American society that you've articulated there, I mean, can anything really be done to bridge them in a presidential term? And I mean, is Joe Biden going to be able to make significant moves to reconcile these polar opposites?
I think that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, we all know that presidents, for all their power and charisma and authority, can only do so much. I mean, I think there's some very practical things you could do in America to cool down the rhetoric, to cool down the antagonisms, you know, bring back the fairness doctrine, which demanded that on public and on communication channels, the radio in particular, then television, you had to have some kind of balance of opinion, create some kind of national service that would bring young men and women from all parts back to connection with each other in some doing something bigger than themselves. Eliminate the war on drugs. You realize because of the war on drugs, there are more Americans with arrest records than there are with college degrees. You know, here's an interesting statistic. In the last 20 years, the use of the word "I" in all published literature has gone up 80%. You know, now don't quote me on that, but the trend is that, and it's reflective of this world. Back to Moynihan's comment, if I believe it, it's true. You know, people are feeling free to reinvent their own realities. And that's a very dangerous situation when the truth itself becomes relative. And the position of the individual is, if I believe it, it's true.
Now, I had an old professor at St Andrews University, Wade. Every time I wrote "I believe" in an essay, scored it out with the words, "I hope everything in this essay is what you believe." But looking at America as its position as the preeminent world power, how much of the tensions we see in the American political system are due to that position of preeminence, perhaps the American era, as you put it, coming to a close?
The bottom line is that a country that has been served by a certain myth, and remember, myths are not just old stories, they're kind of moral charters, you know, they're aspirational. You know, no country lives up to its mythology, but we sort of aspire to see ourselves in that. And America has had, in the 20th century, a myth of its own exceptionalism. But all of that is frankly falling apart. People feel it on the ground when their jobs are disappearing. One of the things that was interesting, Alex, in that Rolling Stone piece you mentioned, the reactions I had, it hit a complete nerve. 362 million social media hits. There was naturally a tsunami of reaction. And the reaction was twofold. It was either kind of deep sadness at what I was suggesting might be the fate of America, and a kind of quiet, earnest desire to do something about it. But the other reaction that I found so fascinating was vicious misogyny, vicious comments against women. And the article, of course, says nothing one way or another about women. And I found that bewildering. I mean, truly awful language. And then I suddenly thought, well, you know, maybe what's going on in part is that for a certain cohort, at least, and I'm not saying that everybody in the Trump camp or voters is in this cohort, but there was certainly a cohort of working men who, with limited education, could get a job, buy a house, buy a car, support a family, and so on. And that world's over. And those factory jobs are long gone, and they watched them go. They saw what globalization meant in their lives. And that the years of that transformation economically also corresponded to the years in which women were breaking the glass ceiling, gays moving from the closet to the altar, people of color from the woodshed literally to the White House. And I just had the sense that all of those trends are sort of conflated by a certain cohort of the American public, so that there's sort of, you know, they took my jobs, it was the women who did it. I mean, literally that is the only way I can account for being called things like menstrual discharge in some of these emails, which were so ad hominem, so personal, so vicious, so angry. and so irrational in some sense.
Let's end on a hopeful note, Wade. Watching the, I almost said the acceptance speech of Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, I mean, you'd be difficult not for your heart not to beat a little faster as she described her background as a woman of colour from a variety of ancestry. And coming in with Joe Biden against the backcloth of what has been a pretty disruptive period, isn't there an opportunity for the resilience of America to shine through and surprise us all with the extent of progress that could be made?
Absolutely. And look, I mean, in my opinion, Alex, all these trends that disturb some people are signs of progress. Imagine the 1950s was no golden era. If you were a woman, if you were Black, if you were a gay person, or if you're any kind of person outside of a certain cohort. We've made huge progress. And I watched those speeches with tears in my eyes, not because I'm an ardent Democrat, because I saw the return of decency. I saw my father on stage. I saw my father-in-law, Senator Charles Percy, a Republican all of his life, on stage. I saw the decency of a Gerald Ford, who came into a moment of enormous crisis after Watergate and put his whole political career not just in jeopardy, but he knew it was over the minute he pardoned Nixon. And I thought as a young student at the time, it was a horrible thing to do. I now, as an adult, look back and think it was the wisest thing he possibly could have done. We had to move on. And America has been able to do that. It's found the better angels of its nature. There was dark periods in American past, both historically in terms of the Civil War, the Depression, the crisis of World War II, but also dark periods like Joseph McCarthy. And all it took was one good man in that critical and famous moment to say in public, on camera, have you no shame? And the question really for us, Alex, is to ask ourselves, does the very notion of shame still exist in America? Are there lingering elements of decorum, of decency, of honor? One prays for the sake both of America and the world that there are. And I think with Joe Biden, we have the best chance of seeing that revealed in the presidency.
Wade Davis, for your exceptional insight. Thank you so much for joining me once again on The Alex Salmond Show.
Thanks so much, Alex. I love to be with you.
A narrow majority in America and a rather larger one around the world were well satisfied with the idea of Donald Trump as a one-term president. Yet, it may be that they've all breathed a sigh of relief too soon. That Donald may be on his way out for now, but Trumpism as a political force looks formidable still. Indeed, the Donald is the bookie's favourite to lead the Republican ticket himself in 4 years' time. Most importantly, the election laid bare the underlying changes in American society which will dictate the political future. The new team of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will attempt to bind up the wounds of the election and indeed of the nation. However, the task will be by no means easy nor short. But for now, from Alex, myself and all at the show, it's goodbye, stay safe, and we hope to see you all again next week.